Hello everyone. Today we are going to continue with the static model. Building on the understanding of the optimization behavior of the representative consumer and firm, we are in a position to allow them to interact in the input market and output market. This is what we call equilibrium analysis. In the last lecture, we have seen how to model the supply side and demand side of the labor market using optimization problems of the representative consumer and representative firm separately. Under the classical assumption of competitive market, optimization of the two representative agents results in two intra-temporal conditions. For the consumer, it is wage W equals to the marginal rate of substitution between leisure L and consumption C. For the firm, it is wage W equals to the marginal productive labor N. There is actually an implicit condition for the government, which simply tries to make its ends meet. In mathematics, it means taxation T equals to government expenditure G. There is a very important point worth mentioning over and over again, the role of wage W. It is treated as an exogenous variable in the representative consumer and representative firms' optimization problems, because they are price takers. Therefore, the optimal solutions of labor supply and labor demands are both functions of W. However, what is the correct or equilibrium value of wage per se? If we can understand the driving force of wage, then we can understand fluctuations of other endogenous variables like labor N, consumption C, and output Y. To summarize, the causality runs like this. The exogenous variable determines wage, and wage determines endogenous variables. If we can understand the entire causality, it would help us to make policies to reduce business cycle. Looking at this conceptual framework again, the previous lecture focuses on the representative agent's optimization behavior at a certain wage. This lecture will investigate the interactions between representative agents to analyze the equilibrium wage per se in the labor market. Therefore, the first learning objective is to know how to combine the intra-temporal conditions of the consumer and the firm to solve the competitive equilibrium. Then, we will discuss the two properties of the competitive equilibrium, which are the two fundamental theorems. Then, we are going to apply the competitive equilibrium to explain business cycles based on exogenous variables and mechanisms. Finally, we will draw some policy implications from the two opposite schools of thought. First, let's combine the consumer's and the firm's optimization behavior for the competitive equilibrium. As we mentioned many times earlier, microfoundation means deriving relationships from two microeconomic principles, optimization and equilibrium. Optimization is about individuals, and equilibrium is about interactions among individuals. Intuitively, optimization is when everyone is happy, while equilibrium is when no one is unhappy. Therefore, optimization is a necessary condition of equilibrium. In economics, optimization leads to the intra-temporal conditions for the consumer and the firm, while equilibrium implies the market clearing condition. Because if some market is not cleared, that means some people are not happy due to excess supply or excess demand. A partial equilibrium requires only one market to clear, while a general equilibrium requires all markets to clear. Walras derived a law in 1870s stating that if there are n markets, then as long as n-1 markets are cleared, the nth market is guaranteed to be cleared. For the Walras law to hold, there are some restrictions and assumptions. In general, we require all markets to clear to have an equilibrium. In mathematics, we can express equilibrium as the solution of all endogenous variables in terms of exogenous variables. Note that once we combine the supply side and demand side by market clearing conditions, wage becomes endogenous. Therefore, in equilibrium, we need to solve for wage as well. The previous solution of labor supply and labor demand are functions of wage, so they are not the equilibrium solution, only the optimal solution. It is always the case that price variables are exogenous to individuals, but endogenous to the market. You must be very careful of the nature of these price variables when doing the analysis, because the nature of the variable determines if they are the cause or they are the effect. Let's start with the mathematical way of obtaining the competitive equilibrium. Note that in any simultaneous equation system, the number of unknowns must be the same to the number of equations. Otherwise, you can't solve it. Therefore, if you introduce or reintroduce an endogenous variable back into the system, you will need an independent equation to describe how this variable is determined. From the representative consumer's optimization problem, we have an intratemporal condition. We can also reintroduce consumption back into the system. Recall that we actually substitute consumption out of the system when we optimize. Now, if you want to solve for consumption as well, then you have to bring the budget constraint back because it determines consumption. Similarly, we reintroduce the time constraint to solve for labor N. From the representative firm's optimization problem, we also have an intratemporal condition. We also reintroduce output and profit back into the system by production function and the profit definition. From the government's problem, we have a budget constraint for the public sector, namely tax revenue equals to government expenditure. Remember that endogenous variables are those you try to explain within the system, and exogenous variables are those you try to use to explain endogenous variables, and they are determined outside the system. The endogenous variables are the unknowns, and the exogenous variables are the knowns. I labeled the endogenous variables in red and exogenous variables and parameters in green. In total, there are 7 unknown endogenous variables to be solved in 7 equations. In principle, you should be able to solve it. The process is a little bit tedious, but the idea is very straightforward. You simply substitute out the unknowns out of the system one by one. Each time you substitute out an unknown, you use one equation. Iterate until you have only one unknown variable in one equation, and you can solve for that endogenous variable. It doesn't matter which endogenous variable you leave for the last. But in economics, we usually keep the price variables to be solved first. Once you solve for that endogenous variable, you can solve for all endogenous variables. The tutorial question gives you a specific example of solving for competitive equilibrium. In practice, a serious macroeconomic model can have 30-something endogenous variables. We usually use computers to solve for the equilibrium rather than by hand. But this 7-variable equation system in our module is simple enough to be solved by hand. Maths is not everyone's cup of tea. That is why graphs are sometimes used to provide an alternative but equivalent view of the equilibrium. It is less strict, but more intuitive. However, all curves and lines in the graph have maths behind, so you cannot just get away from the maths after all. For the 7 equations in the previous slide, economists usually combine some of the equations to show a combined condition for the equilibrium. A popular way of combination is to combine all the constraints of the consumer, the firm, and the government to form a production possibilities frontier, or PPF. I will leave the job for you to derive the PPF. Here is just a tip for you. When you combine the 5 constraints, you reduce the number of unknowns too. So it is basically substituting out other endogenous variables like n, pi, t, and y. Only keep 2 essential endogenous variables, c and l, which are the 2 inputs of the utility function. As you can see from this combined condition, or the PPF, it is essentially a trade-off relationship between consumption C and leisure L. If you enjoy more leisure, you must give up some enjoyment of consumption. The slope of the PPF is called the marginal rate of transformation, MRT, which describes the trade-off ratio between the 2 goods, consumption C and leisure L. Remember that we still have 2 equations left, the intratemporal conditions for the consumer and the firm. The intratemporal condition for the consumer simply states that the marginal rate of substitution between leisure and consumption must be equal to wage, and that for the firm states that the marginal product of labor is equal to wage. In the graph, the MRS is the slope of the tangent indifference curve, and the marginal product of labor coincides with the slope of marginal rate of transformation, noting that the PPF is just the displacement of the production function. Therefore, the equilibrium point J is where MRT equals MRS equals to marginal product equals to wage. This graph also shows an important implication. If the entire economy is centralized as a social planner's problem, then the optimal choice would be the same as the decentralized competitive equilibrium, where consumers and firms are separately optimizing and interacting. It is because the social planner's optimal choice is also point J, which results in the highest indifference curve for the social welfare. The slope of point J is both MRS and MRT and wage. This is actually the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. It states that under certain conditions, competitive equilibrium is efficient. It essentially says that leave the job of resources allocation to the market, which acts like an invisible hand to serve the common good. As long as the market is competitive, the equilibrium is efficient. Or in other words, there is no way to make someone better off without making someone else worse off. However, this theorem is only about efficiency property of the competitive equilibrium. It says nothing about fairness of the equilibrium. On the contrary, the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics is about distribution and redistribution. It states that, under certain conditions, any efficient outcome can be achieved by competitive equilibrium via lump sum tax. It justifies the role of the visible hand or the government intervention. It essentially says that if you choose among several efficient allocations, you can use lump sum tax to achieve the fairest one. To summarize, the first theorem states that competitive equilibrium is always an efficient allocation, while the second theorem states that an efficient allocation can be achieved by competitive equilibrium and lump sum tax. To understand the relationship and difference between the 2 fundamental theorems, I usually use a metaphor. We know that all fathers are male, just like all competitive equilibrium is efficient. The first theorem is a sufficient condition. The reverse of the statement is not always true. All males are not fathers. But any male can be a father as long as he provides love to his family. Therefore, the second theorem is a possibility, a necessary condition, rather than a sufficient condition. I will repeat this metaphor again. All fathers are male, and any male can be a father if he can love. All competitive equilibrium is efficient, but any competitive equilibrium can be achieved if lump sum tax is used. The two theorems are powerful and idealized. However, the reality does not always satisfy the certain conditions phrase in the two theorems. For example, the market is not always competitive. There can be monopoly, externality, information asymmetry, and the tax cannot always be lump sum. Lump sum tax means everyone is taxed the same amount from their total income, independent of their consumption, so it does not affect prices. In practice, however, most taxes are distortionary because it is a proportion of the original price. If taxes distort prices, then it is not lump sum, and the resulting equilibrium is no longer efficient, as the second theorem states. Among others, one important violation of the certain conditions is nominal rigidity, which leads to disequilibrium where supply and demand are not equal. This is a very important assumption to distinguish between classical and Keynesian models, which we are going to introduce in topic 3 and 4. We simply mention this here to give you a heads up. Now that we have obtained the competitive equilibrium of the static model, it is time to apply this model to explain business cycles in the labor market. We will analyze the effects of 4 driving factors, which are all exogenous. The first factor we are going to analyze is the total factor productivity Z on the supply side. In the classical tradition, as the Say's law argues, business cycles are driven by supply-side fluctuations in total factor productivity. The argument is that supply creates its own demand. If one is more productive, then he has higher income, and a higher income means greater demand. Classical or micro-founded version of the Say's law is termed as the real business cycle or RBC model. Our static model is actually a simplified version of the RBC model because the complete version also has dynamic features, but our version is only static. Based on the intratemporal conditions and the constraints we have derived, we can see that if productivity Z rises, the PPF will shift from the lower position to a higher position. Now let's analyze the effect of a higher Z on endogenous variables. First, when Z increases, for the same level of input, the output rises because the production function shifts up with the higher productivity. Second, due to a higher Z, the slope of point B is greater than that of point A. Recall that the slope is also the wage, so wage rises as Z increases. It suggests that wage is procyclical and matches the stylized facts. Finally, the shift of equilibrium from point A to point B can be decomposed into a substitution effect from A to D and an income effect from D to B. The two effects cancel out each other and leave labor supply unchanged. So labor supply is acyclical in this model, which is at odds with the stylized facts in the data on employment. Nevertheless, the working hour is acyclical in the data. The RBC model blurs the intensive and extensive margin because there is a representative agent, so it cannot separate the business cycles of unemployment rate and working hours. So we established that productivity is an important factor of business cycles. But how important is it? The new classical RBC model actually states that Z seems to be the only important factor. Look at the graph on the left. The business cycle is measured by the percentage deviations of GDP from its trend, the black line, and the productivity is measured by the solo residual, the blue line. As you can see, they almost coincide all the way through, and productivity can account for more than 90% of the fluctuations during business cycles. The next question is how to explain the fluctuations of productivity per se. Many economists regard the energy price as the underlying determinant of productivity. Look at the oil price on the right. You can identify the correlation of oil price surges and the timing of recessions in the history. Now let's turn from the supply side to the demand side. The government spending G is an exogenous variable to the system. Therefore, the fluctuations of G can lead to business cycles too. This is the opposite tradition to the classical supply-side theory, the Keynesian theory. It argues that the business cycles are mainly affected by demand-side policies like government expenditure G and taxation T. As G or T changes, PPF shifts because the minimum value is minus G. To see why, please go back to slide 8 to see the function form of the PPF, which is C equals to the production function minus G. The minimum of PPF is when labor supply is equal to 0, so the production function is equal to 0, and the value of PPF in this case is just equal to minus G. Consequently, the optimal indifference curve drops from I1 to I2 if there is an increase of G. Obviously, leisure drops from L1 to L2, which means labor increases. A higher labor input means a higher output. Therefore, employment is cyclical, which is exactly what we observe in the stylized facts and the data. However, the slope of point B, which is the wage, is now flatter than the original point A because of the diminishing marginal productive labor. To see this, note that point B employs more labor, so point B has a lower marginal productive labor due to the new classical diminishing law. As a result, wage is countercyclical, which is at odds with the stylized facts we observe in the data. As we have seen in the previous slide, the Keynesian theory suggests that G can promote output out of recessions. It was true in history, especially after the Second World War. However, the effect of G seems to be less and less effective because of the crowding out effect. The reason is a higher public consumption G needs to be financed by a higher tax, which reduces private consumption C. A higher tax has a similar effect of a higher government expenditure. In fact, a higher government expenditure leads to a higher tax. In our simple static model, the tax was assumed to be lump sum, so everyone pays the same amount. So wages are not distorted. In practice, income taxes are usually collected proportional to wages, which effectively distorts the wage by a difference between the wage paid out by firms and the wage received by consumers. The new budget constraints can accommodate this change by adding a coefficient of 1 minus t for wage W. We can prove that the distortionary tax makes the competitive equilibrium no longer efficient. For simplicity, assume a linear production function, so the PPF is also a linear function, AB. Therefore, point E is the social optimum, which is the best we can achieve as a society. So point E is Pareto efficient. Note that this is a centralized economy without an explicit labor market. Everyone works and consumes according to the optimal resources allocation plan of E, arranged by the central planner. If, however, we adopt a decentralized market economy like in reality and collect a proportional income tax, then the budget constraint is flatter due to the additional term 1 minus t in the slope. The resulting competitive equilibrium is point H, which is associated with the lower indifference curve I2. The intuition behind the different outcome is that a distortionary income tax is a disincentive to work, so it leads to a lower than optimal employment. To summarize, if lump sum tax is not possible, then the fundamental theorems no longer hold, so the competitive equilibrium is not efficient due to the distortionary effect of proportionate income tax. From the government's perspective, what matters is the tax revenue, which is equal to tax rate multiplied by tax base. As analyzed in the previous slide, a higher proportionate tax rate, T, has two opposite effects. The first effect is called the mechanic effect. A higher tax rate obviously will increase the tax revenue if the tax base is fixed. The second is called the behavioral effect. A higher tax rate is a disincentive of work, so there will be less working hours to be taxed, or less tax base. At one extreme, when tax rate is equal to 0, the tax revenue is equal to 0 because everything multiplied by 0 is 0. At the other extreme, when tax rate is equal to 100%, the tax revenue is also equal to 0 because no one is going to work if all income is to be handed into tax. In reality, the tax rate lies between 0 and 100%. The tax revenue is also positive, so the shape of tax revenue must look like an inverse U shape, and there is a turning point. On the left side of the turning point, the mechanic effect dominates. As tax rate rises, the tax revenue rises. On the right side of the turning point, the behavioral effect dominates. As tax rate rises, the tax revenue drops. The turning point corresponds to the revenue maximization rate, T star. This curve is called the Laffer Curve because it was originally drawn by American economist Laffer on a napkin in a restaurant. Therefore, to reduce the tax rate or to raise the tax rate, it all depends on which side of the status quo is. The economist's job is to find out T star based on economic data and where we are now. Now we have seen that supply side and demand side shocks can both be important drivers of business cycles. Other factors can exacerbate the magnitude and persistence of business cycles. So to build a serious macroeconomic model of business cycles in the labor market, these mechanisms are necessary to match quantitative data. The first is nominal rigidity, which means that labor markets are not always in equilibrium due to fixed wages and prices. There are many models to achieve nominal rigidity, such as sticky information, staggering contract, menu costs, and bounded rationality. We will elaborate these extensions in the topic 4. The second is real rigidity, which means that labor markets are not always in equilibrium due to non-monetary reasons, such as market power, insider-outsider, search and matching, coordination failures, etc. We will introduce search and matching model in the next week. In addition, there are also some factors in capital market which can also contribute to business cycles in the labor market. These topics are for advanced macroeconomics, so I won't give details here. If you are interested, you can consider choosing the module Labor Economics. This slide briefly illustrates the intuition of how nominal rigidity can exacerbate business cycles in the labor market. The technical details of this type of models will be taught in topic 4. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, the unemployment rate in the UK is as high as 25%. That means 1 in 4 workers cannot find a job. This phenomenon cannot be explained by classical theory because in the competitive equilibrium, unemployment is voluntary. Workers choose to work or not to work and how much to work. In reality, it is obviously not the case. Workers wanted to find jobs, but they couldn't. Keynes argues that wages are likely to be fixed and cannot be adjusted downward due to political reasons. However, this fixed high wage can exacerbate the unemployment rate in recessions. To see this, let's look at the diagram to see the intuition. In the classical model, when there is a negative shock shifting the labor demand to the left, the equilibrium employment drops from point A to point B. The gap between A and B is the voluntary unemployment. However, if wage is fixed at the original level of this red line, then the labor supply is still at point A, while the labor demand is much lower at point C. The excessive supply, or unemployment, AC, is much greater than the voluntary unemployment, AB. The gap between the two is called involuntary unemployment. As you can see, if wage is rigid, then recession can be more serious. The previous section focuses on positive analysis of business cycles in the labor market, because it is basically descriptive. Building on that, we are now going to talk about some policy implications which belong to the normative analysis. The key question is, how can we use stabilization fiscal policy to reduce business cycles in the labor market? There are two opposite opinions in this issue. If you are an advocate for classical school, then you believe that business cycles are driven by supply-side shocks like productivity, which is exogenous and beyond the control of the government. If so, there is no need and there is no way to stabilize the economy, so the best you can do is to do nothing. By contrast, if you are supporters of Keynesian school, then you believe that the market is flawed and the government can and should do something to fine-tune the economy by using counter-cyclical fiscal policies to reduce the recession, or at least stop the recession from sliding into depression. By counter-cyclical, it means that in recessions, the government should increase expenditure G and decrease tax T to stimulate the economy. In booms, the government should do the reverse to cool down the economy. In practice, everyone is Keynesian to some extent. The real question is how large the government should be and how much the government should intervene. Market, the invisible hand, is not perfect. So government, the visible hand, is needed. However, the government is not perfect either. As we have shown earlier, government interventions such as taxation can distort the economy, so the cure might be worse than the disease. This slide introduces a simple model of the optimal government size or intervention. Essentially, it is a question of trading off between private consumption and public consumption. To see this point, assume that there is a cost to transform tax T to government expenditure G due to bureaucratics. Therefore, G is equal to a fraction Q of T. The output Y produced by consumers and firms is partly used as private consumption C, and the rest of it is collected as tax T, which is then transformed by public sector into public consumption G. Combined with the assumption of G equals to Q multiplied by T, we have Y equals to C plus G over Q. If we express private consumption C in terms of the public consumption G, then we have this equation, C equals to Y minus G over Q, which is the production possibility frontier in the coordinates of C and G. This is a linear function of C in terms of G, with a negative slope of 1 over Q. If we assume a utility function of C and G for the consumers, then we can solve the optimal government size G at point A. If the transformation efficiency Q rises, the slope of the PPF 1 over Q becomes flatter. The new equilibrium is point B. Again, you can decompose this change into a substitution effect from A to D and an income effect from D to B. This lecture analyzes different drivers of business cycles in the labor market based on the static version of the new classical RBC model. It includes productivity on the supply side, fiscal policies on the demand side, as well as nominal rigidity and other exogenous factors. If lump sum tax is not available, proportionate tax can distort wages and incentives, resulting in a Laffer curve for tax revenue. If you have difficulty in understanding why curves shifts, please read Lecture 2 in the short course on quants on the website. And please do the self-test questions and the rest of the questions of Tutorial 1. Have fun!